I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.
Is Jared in class today? Jared, are you here? Oh, yes, you are.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to I Mix What I Like again. I'm Jared Ball. Happy to be your host. Please come on in and welcome. Please do all the things, support the platform, and come on in. And greetings. Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you all for making your way over here. And yeah, looking forward to this discussion. I do expect our guest to be here at any moment, Christian Chiakulas, and then I'll have to get clarification on the pronunciation because Christian is referenced in the article I wanted to talk about with you all today, and then since I've been again reading his thesis on John Brown. And we had been in touch. I figured, and he was amenable that we would have a conversation. So, yeah. So there is a so in that atheist critique YouTube space, one of the channels that comes up on my algorithm from time to time is a former the host is named Aaron. And he is a former Christian Scientologist, and I think it's called Leaving Scientology or something like that. And now he's got the original clip because his name is Aaron, and then in the original skit, you hear, is Aaron here? Is Aaron here? So then apparently, because what's my man's name? Now I forgot his name. The actor, Keegan Michael Key, right? Because he's I think a Detroit Lions fan, and they got Jared Goff, the quarterback. I think that's right. I don't watch the league anymore, so I don't know who's where. But he did a whatever he was saying. How does he say it again? I clipped it and edited. How did
Is Jared in class today?
Jared? So he did one sort of at the request. So when I saw that, I said, you know, that's as close as I'm going to get. So let me grab that. I did see somebody, I'm sure they were joking, but in a chat the other day suggested that I paid, I guess went through one of those apps where you can get celebrity. I think he's still probably too big a celebrity for that, but where you can get a celebrity to do a thing. But no, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. That's just skillful editing. You know what I'm saying? All right, so I'm going to get started because I may have a bit of a time crunch today. So just in case, I do want to get to this article. I didn't expect to get into this John Brown rabbit hole, but what can I say? So one thing I did want to say very, very quickly, I have been, and this is where memory, mine in particular, cannot be trusted. I've been misquoting and misreferencing, rather, Du Bois's book on John Brown for years. For some reason, when I read it many, many years ago, I remember Du Bois saying of Harriet Tubman that she agreed with John Brown's plan and was on her way to join John Brown, but just didn't get there in time, and there was something wrong with the timing. So then when in the James McBride book, which I know is not, you know, it is fiction, when there was a scene where Harriet Tubman is insistent that John Brown pick a time and stick to it, I said, this must be something McBride is pulling from the historical record that connected back to that Du Bois piece that I was remembering, and it all made sense. But I've just started listening to the Du Bois book again. And in the Du Bois book, it says not that. It says that Harriet Tubman agreed with John Brown and would have been at Harper's Ferry, but was sick. That her life of enslavement and abuse and struggle and freedom and just constantly being on the run led her to constantly being in some form of struggle with her health and whatnot. And at that point, when she was trying to link up with Brown, she was sick. So there it is. So apparently I don't know how I got that and where that came from, but anyway. So it looks like our guest is here. So let me bring them up on the stage, and then we can check on the is Sudeep here? Yeah. So everybody, real quick before I do that, so be reminded that Sudeep is going to be joining me this week. Actually, this week is going to be busy. Hold up. Wow. This is how I spend my spring break. Listen, so in 2 days' time, Asian Triangulation in an Anti-Black World, featuring Sudeep Bhattacharya, who's going to join me. So please, calendar that. And then Friday, the next day, Samantha Youssef is coming back to talk with us about 2 films we're going to be reviewing: Palestine 3-6 and All That's Left of You. So please just be mindful of that as well. So salute to them. And okay, so all right, here we go. Let me bring Christian up here. Christian Chiakulas. How close am I to that? Please correct me on that. Welcome. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. It's Chiakulas. It's just like chocolate, but with an S.
Oh, Chiakulas. Okay. All right.
Yep.
There it is. Well, Christian Chiakulas, welcome to the show. Thank you for the engagement and welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So there's so much to get to. I don't have all the time in the world today, as I somewhat like to. But let's start with your work, which I'm still working through your thesis, and then we can come to this article that I'm hoping you got a chance to look at, the Communism of John Brown. Okay, great. In which you are referenced. But let's start with your work, and then if you want to just give an overview, a quick summary of that work and what your intent was, and maybe any criticism or response to how I characterized it the other day. All of that is welcome as well. But yeah, let me give you a few minutes to lay out how you come to John Brown and what your work intends to do, and clean up any of my errors, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, and I don't really have any errors to clean up, so I'll spoil that right away. From the parts that you went through, it seems like you were kind of almost immediately picking up what I was putting down, so I got nothing on that front. But the thesis is called "The Hands of God and the Glittering Sword: A Theological History of John Brown." It was my master's thesis in history, which I did at Fort Hays State University in Kansas. And I was interested in John Brown just because I had to do my degree in American history because I'm a public school teacher, and if you want to teach history in American public schools, they really want you to focus on American history. So he's kind of one of my favorite subjects in American history just because he's a pretty unique and interesting figure. I think a lot of us can agree on that. And I wanted to kind of tackle it from like a radical revolutionary angle. I also I co-founded this group called Red Star Ministry. We have a pretty we're pretty active on Facebook, so if anyone has heard of us, it's probably from there. We kind of advance like a Marxist Christianity. So that's kind of like our little niche. And I wanted to, because I'm already very familiar with like liberation theology and Marxism, and because John Brown himself was a Christian and he talked about it all the time, I just wanted to do something that analyzed him from that lens and like bring in the Marxist, the historical materialist element to that, because that's something that I hadn't seen analyzed when I studied him. I know obviously a lot of radicals and communists are really interested in John Brown. You see a lot of like memes about him on the internet all the time. But when you go to like actual published work about him, especially, a few years ago as I was starting to study this, it was more written from like a kind of like liberal historiography, like mainstream. So I just wanted to fill a little bit of a niche there. And what I basically argue, to like really boil it down, is John Brown was a utopian socialist. He's best understood as some sort of utopian socialist. That his ideas about God and theology, which were very strongly rooted in the kind of like early American Puritan tradition of like Jonathan Edwards, Samuel Hopkins, that those actually influenced his decisions to be like a violent, radical terrorist abolitionist. And then finally, I wanted to talk about like the issue of, is he, his sanity? Was he insane? And what does the debate around his sanity like say about America, about the kind of response to abolitionism at the time, and how we look back on slavery and abolitionism like now?
Right. So what do you think it reveals?
That was a lot. Sorry. So
no, that was great. What? Yeah. So but yeah.
So
yeah,
I think that like the very like base level of it, which I think like most people on the political left should be able to agree with, is that the appellation of insane to someone like John Brown is like relative, right? So he's insane in a world where slavery was considered sane and normal. So like in that regard, calling him insane is to basically like launder the kind of historical legacy of slavery and say like, oh, well, in its time period, it was whatever, which is an argument you see from unfortunately way too many people today. So there's that kind of like base level of, oh, it's no measure of sanity to be well adjusted to an insane world. It is like, I'm probably paraphrasing, but that's like a cliche that people say, and it's fine. But like taking the liberation theology angle to it, and I have to say that in liberation theology is often associated with like Latin American movements, and while I am a huge admirer of those movements, It's actually like the American Black Protestant theologian James Cone, who is more of an influence on how I approach liberation theology. Um, and so, like, looking at his lens, he talks in his books about like the place of violence and what it means to be like white and black in a racist society, what blackness means. And I think that if you look at the debate around sanity through that lens, um, it it tells you that white America, even today in the 21st century, and throughout history, as we look back on slavery and abolitionism and just the role of like that violence plays in political change and political discourse, um, white America, white capitalist America is like not even remotely ready to put violence in any kind of like historical or theological or ethical framework. It doesn't have one for violence. So calling John Brown insane is really like a tacit admission that you don't have like a proper theory of violence as it relates to social change. That's, I think, what I was trying to get at with that. I don't know if I was necessarily fully successful in that section, but that's kind of my idea behind it.
So, sort of dovetailing with this other article, the Communism of John Brown. I One of the things that I've been enjoying and being fascinated by and brand new to is what is apparently this white Christian Marxist tradition that extends in this country and beyond. That was informing John Brown directly and indirectly. I mean, I think I can't remember who said exactly what, but both of you sort of, I think, alluded to the fact that Brown wasn't, it's not that he was reading Marx or knew of Marx and Engels or anything like that, but that there were other communists and other socialists and others within the white Christian church who were familiar with either the works of those two or the works of others who were also informing and debating even Marx and Engels. Could you talk just a little bit about that? And some of what that tradition is, both within Christianity and then the radical political theorists that were influencing those within that radical strand of the white church, which, yeah, is admittedly all brand new to me.
Yeah. So like I want to be clear because a lot of like mainstream historians, they get really touchy if you start talking about stuff like this. Like, so I got to be clear that I don't think John Brown was influenced by Marx specifically in any way, because that's like the kind of thing, if you even allude to that, they'll be like, "Oh, do you have a source for that?" Um so John Brown died in 1859, so only, less than a decade after the Communist Manifesto was published, before Capital. So, like, obviously, to call him a Marxist would not be correct. And also, there were some Marxists in America at that time in the 1850s. Very few. It was a very emerging movement, but I don't think John Brown would have liked them because they were not very supportive of the abolitionist movement, which they saw as kind of like a distraction from class struggle and like not something that was of their concern. Du Bois writes about this a little bit in Black Reconstruction. That like the very first generation of American Marxists were just not good on the slavery question. So John Brown probably would have not liked them. But where I think there is enough evidence that you can draw a very strong connection is in this like utopian communalist Christian tradition that has been around for, since the beginning of Christianity. In the book of Acts, it refers to the earliest disciples of Jesus putting all their property in common. That article that you mentioned about the Communism of John Brown talks about the letter that John Brown Jr. wrote in the immediate aftermath of the Haymarket affair here in Chicago, where, he says, he gets a little bit into the distinction between anarchism and communism, but he said that, like, me and my father, John Brown, we very much admired that strand of Christianity, the common property of the earliest Christians, and that is our communist or socialist faith. And I actually should have included that quote in my thesis, but I couldn't find like the source of it at the time, so I didn't. But it definitely would have fit in there as well. So I think that's like enough historical evidence to make the claim John Brown was a socialist. Like I think anyone trying to argue against that historically is being kind of silly. But so he was not the only Christian, white Protestant Christian American at the time who was influenced by that strand. There were a lot of these kind of utopian communes across America since like the 1700s, maybe even back into the 17th century, the 1600s. One of them in Illinois is called the Bishop Hill Colony. You can go visit it. It's Bishop Hill, Illinois. I went there myself about a decade ago just to see like what that looked like. But the problem with a lot of these communities is they weren't political. So they took this idea of like common property and then they kind of withdrew to these communes where everybody shared everything and there was no private property and they all labored together, but it wasn't really connected to like a theory of politics or economics. It wasn't connected to any kind of like scientific socialism. They weren't trying to like change the world. They were just saying like, well, God wants us to live this way, so we're going to go live this way. Where I see John Brown innovating on that is he draws up this constitution that is explicitly modeled on the United States Constitution, but it takes that kind of idea from the New Testament communalism and says like, here's what this would look like if it was the constitution of a nation. If we're going to like remake America as a post-slavery society, here's how we could apply that on the political sphere. So I think he was a little bit unique for that because most of those communities, and then of course, obviously, Friedrich Engels writes Socialism, Scientific and Utopian to kind of delineate between scientific socialism and utopian socialism. So utopian socialism, which was heavily influenced by Christianity, was a big strain at this time, especially in England. And some like prominent utopian socialists, well, not some, but at least one utopian socialist was among the Harper's Ferry raiders, like a British one who had been involved in like utopian socialist organizing in Britain, and then he came to America to take part in the Harper's Ferry raid. So there's all these like little connections here and there. But John Brown, I think, in moving from the like purely spiritual, like secluded Christian communes and trying to apply it to like a real political constitution, I think was like starting to bridge that gap a little bit from the purely utopian Christian communities to something a little bit closer to like an actual socialist movement.
No, right on. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And by the way, the both Christian's thesis and the article, the Communism of John Brown, are linked in the show description below. I did just want to show very quickly where the article, if I'm remembering correctly, which is as I started with treacherous ground. The article argues or makes the point or suggests that part of the way it argues for the communism of John Brown is in the way the theologian David Bentley describes the translation of the principle of koinonia in Greek, if I'm saying that even close to correctly, which is often translated as fellowship or community. But Bentley argues that a more accurate rendering may very well be communism. And then he's connecting it, as is the author, to this apostolic. No, I'm not saying that right.
I don't know.
Apostolic. Say it again.
Something like that. Apostolic is how I've heard people say it. Yeah.
I'm sure I'm not saying it right. But in other words, connecting it to, or trying to suggest that Brown was drawing from, not obviously or directly necessarily, at least from Marx per se, or Marxists as they would become per se, but from these traditions traditions of interpretation within the church, which seem to have at least lost out. But I at least wanted to just bring that part, which I thought was interesting. And I'll invite you to say anything you like about that. Excuse me. But I did want to also ask you about something that you wrote about, that this article references a little bit, that if I'm getting it correctly, you both seem to argue sort of radicalized Brown, which were his previous efforts at, I guess, a sort of radical engagement with capitalism. That is, something that I don't ever remember, reading about or hearing about, and it seems almost never to be discussed, are his previous efforts, that is Brown's previous efforts in the wool industry, and what that experience led to, and then his reaction to that, which I think is, of course, among the most appropriate forms of response. But could you talk a little bit about what you've written about, because you go into some detail about the industry into which he attempted to enter, and how he tried to enter, and why he tried to enter, which admittedly, to my little bit of narrow focus and work, resonates in an obviously different context. But
yeah,
could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one reason I think this doesn't get discussed, for a long time, throughout the 20th century, when John Brown was kind of looked back on in history, it was often as like, oh, he was this mad, crazy terrorist who like shouldn't be emulated. He was right for the wrong reasons, blah, blah, blah. So his business experiences, which he was not a very successful businessman for any part of his life, those were often framed as like, his failed businesses contributed to him going insane and becoming this violent abolitionist. So if you read a lot of biographies from him from the 20th century, like the one by Stephen B. Oates, I think is like probably the most read from that era. He like really rails into him about how he's this failed businessman. He couldn't handle authority. He wasn't smart enough. He couldn't make it in business. So he took out his frustration on the world, and abolitionism and slavery was really just like the venue he chose to let out his frustrations about him being such a failure. In reality, Brown, he did have a lot of failed business ventures, like that's indisputable, but like the first half of the 19th century was a time in America where like the real seeds of industrial capitalism in the United States were really beginning to sprout. So chapter, I want to say 4 of my thesis is like just completely a political economy of the United States at that time, looking at commodity productions and like proto-industrialization. That's another one of those words you have to be careful about, or else like nitpicky historians will be like, actually, that's not in whatever. But so what I looked at when observing the economic data is that there is just a massive ramp up in commodity production throughout Brown's lifetime in America. And, when he's a child and, the first part of his adulthood, you still see this dominance of like small scale, like pre-industrial family production of household goods. Wool being like a big one. John Brown was in the wool industry. And then towards the end of his life, you start to see the amount of, for example, wool being produced is just like thousands of a percentage points higher than it was when he was a child. Exports are out of control compared to where they were when he was a child. So he, over his lifetime, sees all this social change. And it was really fascinating. I went back to like early Marxist political economy. I reread some sections of like Capital, for example. I reread some sections of Lenin where he talks about the same kind of process underway in Russia throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. And the parallels were like really striking, especially these 2 quotes that I had to put in my thesis, where in Capital, Karl Marx talks about how the process leading up to industrialization involves all of that small scale production of household goods that like every family needs for themselves, things like candles, clothing, food, stuff like that, stuff that every family would produce for itself. Suddenly these are all commodities being created by the working class and sold on the market, and pushing all these like family laborers out into the capitalist industrial or pre-industrial labor market. And like Marx, even in the quote, talks about, he says like coarse woolen stuff. He talks about wool specifically as one of these things. And then just a few years earlier, you have John Brown writing a letter saying that like, ugh, this is horrible. The price of everything is going up. We're not going to be able to make a living anymore because all of these people, we used to make things for ourselves and now we just have to buy them. Now they're all being sold by the market. It's literally exactly what Marx a few years later would write about in Capital. John Brown is talking about seeing it like with, through his lived experience in the early 1850s. So that to me explained these kind of illusions you get from his letters. I had to do a lot of like archival research with his letters for this thesis, and he complains about capital. He warns his kids, don't ever take out loans, don't engage with the financial system. Capital is like a harrow that keeps people buried for their whole life, something like, I'm paraphrasing. He talks about the love of money is like ruining America. There's so many poor people in America, and he's not just talking about slaves here. He was actually writing about experiences in a free state at the time, and he has this letter where he says there's so much poverty in this country that God will send famine and war and pestilence to destroy this wicked nation. So he's obviously remembered most stridently for being so devoted to abolitionism and slavery, but he also has this very like staunch belief about the evils of capital and money, and how it was proletarianizing the United States before his very eyes. So I thought that was just really fascinating and helps to explain why he was different from so many of, like the Republican Party was the abolitionist party. And there's this idea that a lot of Americans today have that like, oh, the Republicans and the Democrats, they just switched platforms. Like they're just the opposite of what they were back then. And while that's true in certain issues, it's a little simplistic because the Republican Party was kind of always this like very bourgeois, like private property rights, free trade, limited government intervention, like small business. The Republican Party was always like that, kind of from their roots in the Whigs even before then. So that, to me, John Brown's like dedication to opposing capitalism and the power of money and like the effects of industrialization, it helped explain why John Brown was so different from all of those like Republican Party abolitionists. And it was because he was more radical. He had more class consciousness. He had a better understanding, even if it was like a very workmanlike kind of unlettered understanding. He saw what was going on with industrialism and capitalism, and he had this like very like proto working class outlook on those things and what they were doing. So yeah, I mean, thought that was like very
sorry to jump in. No, I mean, sorry to jump in. Both of you, by both of you, I mean both the author of this article and you in this thesis, and I think I'm now overlapping several other things at the same time now. But make the point that he only started a business. Again, I'm hearing so many overlaps with my own narrow focus, but you seem to be making a point that he only engaged in starting a business in the first place as a means of challenging the already sort of accumulating, monopolizing tendency among manufacturers, and trying to create a situation where through his business effort, he could create something more egalitarian, that where the producers and everyone would benefit basically equally. So he was, and then recognizing that this wasn't going to work, as the author says here, and I wonder if you agree with this, says that this business venture without a doubt was a radicalizing event for him, one that accelerated his conviction that the whole system was rotten. Now, my question though is that how is he defining the system? Because his response eventually is to go to war with the slave owners and the pro-slavery community, largely of the South and the expanding West. But he doesn't. Why didn't he go to war with the northern capitalists, the financiers, the manufacturers? Why didn't he start dragging them out of their houses the way he was dragging some slaveholders out of theirs? I mean, so in other words, yeah. What do you think about all of that?
No, that's a great question. So I think I would be so I think that what that author wrote is I agree with it. And I think what you said about, how the reason that he went into business is absolutely true of his wool business. But he only started the wool business, in the kind of the late 1840s, I believe. So I will say before then, for the, his first maybe three and a half decades of his life, he kind of did implicitly buy in to this like Jeffersonian like mythology of America as this land where everybody can be self-sufficient and, we're all can be landowners. Because he tried to do that and it didn't work for kind of the same reasons. Like, yes, there was a lot of frontier land for the stealing from Native Americans at the time, and that allowed a lot of people to become landowners who, like in Europe, never ever would have been able to buy land because of the enclosed commons and the legacy of feudalism there. But they come to America and they can just steal this land from the native people. So it allowed for this like rather large class of like petty bourgeois landowners, and John Brown was among those people. But as the century went on, as the policies of Andrew Jackson kind of took effect, and then you start to see this explosion of commodity production, the land became heavily financialized, and people like John Brown started to be pushed out of that. Now, a lot of them just kept pushing further and further west, but John Brown didn't want to do that. He did have this very personal hatred of slavery since he was a young child. His father had been an abolitionist and an Underground Railroad kind of conductor before then. So his hatred of slavery was instilled from a very, very young age. And I think that it was always primary for him. When he went into the wool business, as like Du Bois says in his biography of John Brown, he was doing it to try to counteract these factors. He was saying, well, if all us wool producers form this union, we can better negotiate with the the textile manufacturers who we have to sell our products to. Obviously, as you mentioned, it didn't work. They were able to crowd him out. Manufacturing had too much power in the economy. But I think, to an extent, he did go to war with the class system and the capitalist system, in the sense that he foresaw his Harper's Ferry raid as the beginning of this insurrection that would like really radically reshape American society. And that's why in the provisional constitution he wrote for it, it's not just like, oh, all the slaves are free and then everything goes back to the way it was. I mean, it gives women the right to vote, which is crazy for 1859 or 1858 when it was written. It has all property in common. So it literally like all but comes out and says we are abolishing private property. So I don't think that he necessarily saw like northern industrial capitalists as evil as like southern slave owners, but I think that's very reasonable in the 1850s when you are seeing the slave power, as they called it, like just dominate American politics, get everything they want, kind of rule as this like minority of the country but have majorities in government. The Senate, for example, allowed them to have way more power in the federal government than their numbers would have allowed. So I think he really just saw slavery as like the primary contradiction at the time, and I think he was probably right to do that.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I mean, again, this was not a critique, a hindsight critique.
Yeah.
I was just
I know.
at. And then the other thing I'm also curious. So listen, make sure you bring up anything that you would want to, despite what I ask here. But I am interested in something else that I'm not sure if, again, where I'm getting it. And it may have been in the Du Bois book. And some in the chat will feel me on this maybe more than others, but at one point, so I said that at one point John Brown attempts business and realizes small business solutions are not enough. At one point, he's also attempting to build small schools for Black children that are also supposed to become training centers for future military operations.
Yeah.
And then he sees that building a school isn't enough of a solution either, that doesn't do it either. And then he moves to, humbly, a higher stage of consciousness and says, listen, we got to take a shot here, puns intended, and we have to make something happen, even if I don't live to see the fruits of the benefit of that work. So in that vein, I did want to ask you, because I see some competing versions of this. As best you could tell, you alluded to this a little bit. What was his plan? And
for Harper's Ferry?
Yeah, like what was because so for instance, in the Du Bois book, there's discussion of he had part of his plan was to included everything from guerrilla warfare from the mountains to even just winning and literally freeing the land, and the enslaved become free. The slave masters are either gone or dead, and then the land just becomes nobody has to go anywhere. It just becomes some of it is helping people escape to Canada, and then when he's on his I just when I reread it the other day, he's at his trial, and I don't know to what extent he was being honest or trying to save his life or trying to make a point, but he says, I wasn't trying to do an insurrection. I was just trying to free a couple people and I wasn't really trying. So as best as you've been able to determine, what was his plan? And because he, as you point out, he had this provisional government. He had the Declaration of the July 4th Declaration of Independence,
Declaration of Liberty, yeah.
Declaration of Liberty. So yeah, what do you think was his plan? Yeah.
So when he says, in his trial, I wasn't trying to overthrow the government, and even when the Provisional Constitution says at the end, these articles do not mean that we're trying to overthrow the government, he's making a point. Because the people, the signatories of that Constitution, and I can't remember which one of them later wrote this, they were almost all Black men. It was several dozen Black men and a few white men, including John Brown. One of them recollected afterwards, he said, yeah, it said that, but none of us were under any illusions that we were committing treason. We knew what we were doing. We said it out loud. The first man who signs this document commits treason. And then he goes on to say, and we were all eager to commit treason. So the original plan, now this was a couple years before Harper's Ferry actually happened. That's important to keep in mind, that there's this long gap between when the plan was made and when the Harper's Ferry raid actually happens, and that plays a role, I think, in how it turned out and how John Brown thought about it. But the original plan, as presented to Frederick Douglass and Franklin Sanborn, who were two close allies of John Brown, we all know who Frederick Douglass is. Sanborn was one of Brown's kind of patrons who helped support his activities financially. He was this kind of wealthy Eastern dude. Not really that important. But the plan was to do basically what Brown had been doing in Kansas, and stealthily free slaves from individual plantations, and then hide in the mountains. For the elderly or women and children, people who didn't want to fight, they would be delivered to the Underground Railroad to escape to Canada. But the purpose was to arm the able-bodied men who were willing to join the military force, and slowly swell the ranks of that to be able to then launch more raids, free more captives, send more people to the Underground Railroad, and increase the number of very small 5 to 10 man guerrilla outposts in these mountains. and kind of create like a network of those throughout Appalachia. Somewhere along the way, Brown got it in his head. And so I want to be clear, like, this is the plan that Frederick Douglass probably was like very in support of, because John Brown actually came up with a lot of this plan while staying with Frederick Douglass at his house. Frederick Douglass knew about it in advance. All these other like benefactors, they knew about it, and they thought it was a good enough plan to bankroll it and put Brown in touch with people who could like train the raiders. Somewhere along the way, Brown gets in his head that we should start this off by raiding the armory at Harper's Ferry, because that will give us lots of guns and it will send a signal to the country, basically, that the revolution is at hand. Sanborn says that he thought Brown was like not serious. He thought it was like, just him spitballing and didn't think too much of it. Frederick Douglass, as we know, thought it was crazy and was like, look, I liked your idea, but this Harper's Ferry thing is nuts. You're going to get yourself killed. And he's like, he didn't say like, I wash my hands of it, you're on your own, but he was like, look, my friend. And the way he writes about it in his last autobiography is actually very beautiful. He has this moment, he really in-depth describes their last meeting right before Harper's Ferry. But he said that like, I couldn't follow him there because it was a bad plan. And Shields Green goes with John Brown at that fateful meeting. It's kind of this moment where Frederick Douglass is like, all right, come on, Shields. And Shields Green is like, no, I'm gonna go with John Brown because I like the plan. So it was this kind of like split there. And you see this unfortunate thing happen where when they draw up the provisional constitution, there's like 50 or 60 people who are like ready to start this thing. By the time of Harper's Ferry, it's down to 20. Because of that long time gap, and then the change in plans from kind of these small scale raids to attacking the federal armory. And it also tips the racial balance. When he first came up with the plan, it was mostly black men who were going to follow him and do this. But when he changes it to let's raid Harper's Ferry, it becomes mostly white men who are following him. Which, I don't, the implications of that are probably pretty like nuanced, but it's just worth noting that from the original drawing up of the provisional constitution and the original genesis of the plan to the actual Harper's Ferry raid, it seems to have metamorphosized into something of like a little bit of a different idea. I do still think that when it was written, John Brown thought that his this guerrilla station movement, armed raids that he was starting, he expected it to be able to spread, to control small amounts of territory. The provisional constitution has some things in there where they clearly see themselves undertaking operations and raids into free states. Now, it's not specified what exactly that means, but it's very clear that they foresee themselves having some kind of operations in free states. So it's bigger than just we're just going to free some slaves from these plantations. I think that much is very clear. And the way it's written is very much to supersede the United States Constitution. It talks about having different branches of government. It abolishes the Senate because the Senate is undemocratic, and the Senate was like the part of the legislative branch that the slave power dominated. So I don't think you can read it as just this like, oh, this is how we're going to govern our little organization. It was very clearly an outline of like what the country should look like if Brown's had his way. And you can compare it with earlier documents that he drew up to govern like small militia groups and like the League of Gileadites, which was a self-defense organization he tried to found for black people in the North to resist the Fugitive Slave Act. And those are very different. Those are like charters for like little fraternal organizations. Like it's like, here's how we're going to operate as our organization. The Provisional Constitution really is the constitution of a nation, or at least it's written that way.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, in some in the McBride book, the James McBride book, which is largely fiction, some in the Du Bois book, some in these smaller articles, and I'm not sure to what extent I'm getting any of this from your thesis, but even the plan on Harper's Ferry, despite it being reduced and less desirable by many, at least of the Black participants by the end, had more logic to it than I certainly ever thought it did, as it's described. I mean, he seemed clear. That is, that Brown seemed clear. Like, I know he never intended to be there that long. It was meant to be
Right.
a quick raid, grab stuff and leave. They were supposed to disable the railway, disable the telegraph. There was some, and then break into the hills, and that was part of the plan for the, you know. So there was some, when it was laid out like that, to me, it sounded a lot more doable. Now, I don't know. I'm not really clear, and I don't know if you are, as to what exactly went wrong. The railway worker gets killed, and all these other. I mean, I'm not. Was Harriet on her way, or was she sick? Did she agree with the plan? What was, like? Could you just say a little bit more about any of that? And then we can, and then I want to come back. I do have to begin to wrap, but I want to come back to some of your original intent, at least, before we leave. But yeah, could you say anything more about that?
Yeah. So the evidence points to Harriet Tubman being fully on board with the plan. Harriet Tubman was a very spiritual person. But she struggled with various illnesses throughout her life due to an injury she sustained when she was a child. That's pretty well known. She was, I think she was born into slavery, so we can imagine how she sustained that injury. And it seems like she was sick and she wasn't able to make it. And put yourself in the mindset of the 1850s. It's not like she can send a text and be like, sorry, can't make it today, right? So they may very well have been expecting her to show up at some point. Letting the train go on to the next town was a huge mistake, because that allowed the government to send Robert E. Lee himself to respond. So that was not smart of them. Also, there was part of the plan involved a couple of his men who were supposed to bring these wagons from this like safe house just outside of town that they could load the weapons into. And for some reason, I could not figure out how. I really looked through the documentary evidence. But for some reason, the guys who were supposed to bring those wagons were just late as hell. They took hours and hours. It should have taken them, maybe an hour, but something held them up. They didn't know what they were doing. There was whatever. I don't know. It's speculation. But so those factors led to Brown and his men kind of just getting holed up in that, it was like a fire station or something. They got holed up for hours, and it turned into like a little mini siege, unfortunately. And yeah, I do think with some better planning and some better communication, it would have been doable. I think if it had been the original group that had been, planned on it, these were men who had already escaped slavery, most of them, and like gone through the Underground Railroad. So that's who he originally was supposed to do this plan with. I think those guys probably would have been a lot more competent at something like this. Whereas, like, God bless those men who did go with John Brown, but a lot of them were like young white men, boys in their like late teens, early 20s, who were like fired up by the idea of fighting back against slavery, which is great for them, but they obviously were not super well trained. Another problem is this is like I haven't read James McBride's book, but I saw the TV show, which I didn't really like, and this was one of the things that it got very wrong. I don't know if this is how it is in the books. In the book, John Brown hired this mercenary named Hugh Forbes to train the men for the raid, and Hugh Forbes almost immediately became a snitch and like started informing on the government and like took Brown's money and wouldn't train the men. In the TV show, he is portrayed as just like a con artist who shows up and like cold calls Brown as like, hey, give me a bunch of money and I'll train your men. And Brown gives him the money and then he just vanishes. It wasn't really like that. He worked with Brown over the course of over a year as they were getting ready for the raid, but he was passing information to the government the whole time. So they when they found that out, obviously they stopped contact with him, but then they went underground for a period of several months to kind of let the heat die down. And that is what scared a lot of the original men who had signed the provisional constitution. That is what made them go, all right, the plans, we can't go through with it anymore because they're on to us. And that's what led to Brown replacing a lot of them with these kind of like very eager young men who maybe didn't have the experience they needed to pull something like this off.
No, so I never saw the series, but I did listen to the McBride book at least, and it if Forbes is mentioned at all, it's very quick. There's no sustained discussion. There's no none of what you all, and this is where I'll use it as a segue back to bring us back to your work and to a close, at least for today, unfortunately. But the McBride book really doesn't give us anything about Brown, what produced Brown as the man that he was. That we get his clarity around his version of religion, but there's no discussion of his previous business ventures. There's no discussion of the school. There's no discussion of there's no complicating of of his religious beliefs. In other words, there's no explanation of how, or I should say there's very little, if any. Let me just, because I was listening to the book. I don't know. So I'm not saying I was approaching with the best method for a critique, but there's really no discussion of any of this. So what it does do well, I think, is reduce, if not erase entirely, all of this stuff about him just being insane. It shows him as being an honest, committed, serious person who, I don't know how it ends up being depicted in the series, but in the book, that part, but it doesn't do all the little things that I think, that are really needed to be done, and that I think yours and others' works are attempting, and why. And in other words, as I've said before, I understand why the McBride book became a New York Times bestseller and why it would become the basis of a series like this, because it's not, as good as it is, it's not going to lead people to the complicated and critical conclusions and questions about Brown that I think we should be reaching. And that I think, and I'll ask you as we come back to that point, how I understand what you and others that I'm being introduced to are trying to do with this work. So could you talk a little bit about, so as I gather it, and maybe I'm projecting onto your work what others have said in theirs, because some of them are explicitly saying we're talking to white Christians and saying we want white Christians to revisit Brown and stop ignoring Brown and the traditions and the movements he represented and represents today. So, but yeah, could you talk about what you would like to see happen as a result of your work, or in part because of your work, or what your work is intending to inspire?
So I think, so like what you're alluding to reminds me of some of the arguments that Louis DeCaro makes, who is like the world's foremost biographer of John Brown right now. He's written several books about him. He's great. But I think we do have a little bit of a different approach. He does make that argument that like white Christians should claim Brown and should like look to that legacy and try to live up to it. And I don't disagree with any of that, but with my thesis, I want to be a little bit more like specific and radical than that. So one thing that I really wanted to do that I think I probably could have made even more explicit was I am not only not a pacifist, but I will say I am an anti-pacifist. I think that pacifism has crippled the left as like a political force in the West, especially, and in the United States. And that doesn't mean like, oh, we should all go grab broadswords and start killing people. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that like we need to be able to have more honest theoretical discussions about like the role of violence in like politics in general, not just in like leftist movements. But like we need to rethink violence and what its place is and how it's used to enforce power, what its relationship is to the concept of power. And for Christians especially, I wanted to start advancing this idea that like because there are lots of leftist and communist and Marxist Christians out there, but pacifism still has like a hold on that. So I wanted to kind of start advancing this idea that like, look, you need to rethink this, because if someone who is as committed a Christian as John Brown was, and I don't think anybody can dispute that Christianity was the biggest influence in his ideas and the kind of person he was. And also, if he wasn't crazy, you can't dismiss him by saying he was crazy. So if someone like that, not only he didn't just embrace like self-defense, but he embraced like, no, if you support slavery, we are going to drag you out of your bed and cut your head off because that is what you deserve. Like if he could embrace something like that, the rest of us who want to be leftist Christians in some way, we need to take that seriously. It doesn't mean you have to embrace those methods, but you should think critically about them. So that was a huge part of what I wanted to do with the thesis. I also think that especially, my thesis was published June 2023, and then just a few months later, October 7th, 2023 happened, and we started having to have all these conversations about terrorism again. And I started hearing people use, it brought me right back to 2003 when I was a kid after 9/11, and hearing the way people use the word terrorist to just mean like, you are no longer a human being with political rights whose ideas can be taken seriously. You are someone that America can just drop a bomb on. You're a terrorist, we can kill you. So if I was writing it today, I would include a fuller discussion of terrorism, because I think that what John Brown did at Potawatomi, especially in Kansas, that was terrorism. And I also think it was the right thing to do. So I think that's a discussion that John Brown, it's a challenge that the story of John Brown has for us in the 21st century. It's very politically relevant.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
The crowd was calling for it. It's bars. Christian, listen, I really appreciate you, and I'm going to continue reading your thesis and look forward to another discussion. Forgive me, I'm a little bit more pressed for time today, so I do
No,
need
that's
to.
okay.
But thank you very much for your work. I'm very happy I stumbled upon it, and yeah, look forward to more. I really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ball. I really appreciate you talking to me about it. Keep doing what you do.
Absolutely. Likewise. Thank you very much. And yeah, take good care, Christian. We'll talk again soon. Peace, because I know you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. Boy, I tell you. Christian Chiakulas, everybody. So please check. His thesis is linked in the show description. Please check it out at your leisure, as is the other article that we were talking a little bit about, at least the Communism of John Brown and some of the so Chitty Macha. Yeah. So part of what, so I think specifically this is a Google Scholar find. I have to double check that, but I think that's how I came across the work. I do use Google Scholar, the other databases that we have access to, dwindling as they are through our university. But when I was wanting to add more, because so as I said in the other video, the May Muses video of like 5 months ago, where she had started to talk about the Good Lord Bird series, started me in this direction. But I wanted to not watch the series until I read the book. And then when I read the book, or listened to the book, I wasn't really interested in the series. And I was more interested in the real history. And that's when I just started doing some searching and and that's where I came across Christian's work and some of these others. And there's a lot more. And it's becoming kind of, again, like with everything else, a bit irritating the more I find and the more I realize how much has not been encouraged in all the years of being a, so, whatever, it's so I'm not sure how to pronounce your name as it's written here, but it's good to see you again. And yeah, Google Scholar is kind of nice still. It's kind of nice. And thank you very much to everybody for coming through. There were a couple, just real quick before I get out of here. Gerald Horne always critiques the leftists in the US who never draw analysis from the Haitian Revolution or people like John Brown. Absolutely. So that vibe is throughout a lot of these works. And that's what I'm saying. I'm like, we need some John Brown financial literacy. That's where I was headed with that. He tried the school for Black boys. He tried the small business. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's how I found it. That's how and right, been too long. Good to see you again. Absolutely. No doubt, no doubt. So no, we didn't talk about Cloud Splitter by Russell Banks, which I don't know about, so I have to look into that. But a little bit of the Good Lord Bird, and he's a broadsword makes me think he's a person of culture. So yeah. So that's it. That's it. But okay, listen, unfortunately, I do have to run, everybody. Please do all the things to support the platform and all of that. Please check the work linked in the show description. And definitely thank you all very much for coming through. And there's something I'm forgetting. So I'll see you Thursday, Friday. Please do all those things. Big shout out again to Christian Chiakulas. Salute to John Brown. And peace, everybody. Only if you're willing to fight for it, like Fred Hampton used to say, and as John Brown damn sure did as well. And I'll catch you next time with...
And what did you sacrifice? Calm, kindness, kinship, love. I've given up all chance at inner peace. I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago for which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight have set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.